Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jessica DeGanzik, Vice President of Events for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Welcome to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. An important part of our events and Dan's favorite part of these webinars is hearing from you. So we'll be taking your questions in about 30 minutes. You can submit your questions by entering them on the questions section on the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll get to as many of your questions as possible. Dan will be focusing on 3 topics this week. First, what the New York mayor's race means for the rest of America. Second, democracy versus autocracy, the ultimate global challenge. And third, the Biden breakthrough. Is there really a bipartisan deal? Dan, thank you so much for joining us today, leading another important conversation on these topics. I'll turn this conversation over to you and join you in about 30 minutes with some questions from our audience. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. I'm really looking forward to today's program, and as always, want to thank all of you for joining us today for this conversation. As Jessica mentioned, standing in ably in place of Kim today, we're going to get through 3 topics today, starting with last Tuesday's vote for mayor of New York City. Now, most of our audience, of course, is in California, not in New York. And while we do have audience members who are spread throughout the country, the logical question is, as I've already raised, is why should we be looking at this New York mayoral campaign? And more importantly, what lessons can we draw from it for policy and political discussions around the country? Now, it's going to be another week or possibly 2 before we have the final results of the primary there. And in this era, a Democratic primary victory in New York City is almost certain to become the mayor after the general election is held. But because New York City is now using the ranked choice voting option, in which voters select not just one candidate, but rank 5 on their ballot, it takes a lot more time and it's a lot more complicated to tally the ballots. So it is going to be another week or 2 before we know who won. But right now, it appears very likely that the next mayor of New York City will probably be Eric Adams, who's the former president of the borough of Brooklyn, their former borough president. He's a longtime African-American community leader. And most interesting and most relevant for today's discussion, he's a former New York Police Department police captain. So why does that matter to the rest of the country? Now, we'll go back to talking about New York in just a minute, but I'd like to begin to answer that question by pointing you not to New York City, but to Washington, more specifically to the White House, and more specifically than that, to Joe Biden's day last Wednesday, the day after we last met for last week's webinar. So last Wednesday was a pretty big day in Washington and at the White House. It was the day after the Democrats' very high priority voting rights bill that we've discussed had been filibustered to death. The 2 parties were also on the verge of reaching an agreement on critical infrastructure legislation, which we'll talk about a little bit later today. And President Biden was preparing to meet with the negotiators to try to finalize what would be his first big bipartisan accomplishment. The White House was preparing new immigration policy, and there was significant news that day coming out of Iran, out of Israel, out of China, out of Russia, out of Brazil, out of Mexico, among other places around the world. So what did Biden talk about in his featured media opportunity that day? He didn't talk about voting rights. He didn't talk about infrastructure reform. He didn't talk about any of the international challenges. The message for the day for the White House last Wednesday, on that very important, very busy day in Washington, was crime and public safety. And that's directly related to the New York mayor's election that had been held the day before, last Tuesday. I'll reinforce a point I made a minute ago. In New York City's mayoral election, voters appear to have chosen a former police captain as their city's next leader. And let's put that in some historical context, because that's a vote that took place just over a year after the nation's cities, New York and Los Angeles included, had been roiled by protests after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so while discussion over police reform is continued throughout the country and Congress is still working on its bill, the more strident calls for abolishing the police or dramatically diminishing the role of police that we were hearing last summer largely faded. And as the rates of homicide and other violent crime have risen, the debate over public safety has reversed itself in many large cities, including New York, as many working class and minority communities have made it clear that they prefer a continued police presence to keep them and their families safe. Now, the current increase in homicides and other violent crime is unusual because most cities have not seen a corresponding rise in property crimes. So this is a little bit of a historical aberration. But even while overall crime rates are much lower than they were in the late 20th century, voters in New York and around the country are beginning to turn back to that issue, the issue of crime and public safety, as a priority for them for the first time in a generation. And in fact, crime and public safety were the most important issues in the New York campaign by far. And this public focus on these issues was the major contributing factor to Adams' likely victory. So we're going to ask you a couple questions on these issues, given the lessons we've learned from the New York mayor's race. First question, if we can put it up, Claire, is how important are crime and police issues to you? Are these the most important issue to you? Are they very important? Are they somewhat important? Are they of minor importance, or are they not important at all? And what we'll need to do at some point is come back to this question to ask you if your feelings about this issue are different now than they were a year ago. But let's see the answers to this one if you can, Claire. Wow, very interesting. Look at that. Only 3% say that crime is the most important issue to all of you. But if you add up the next two categories, very important and somewhat important, that's 91% of our group prioritizing crime and police issues at a fairly high level. And only 6% say of minor importance, and no one said that they're not important at all. Let's go right to a second question, because level of importance is only part of the equation here. Let's now see, if we can, Claire, how would you describe your own position on crime police issues now that we've established the level of import on which you push these policy matters? So what do you think? Have we become too soft on crime and we need to get tougher? Which was essentially the Adams message in New York last week. Should we spend more on police and more on preventive measures too? So a balance of both. Should we reduce police funding in order to fund social services, which was an argument we heard much more vocally last summer than we're hearing these days? Or finally, should we simply replace police departments with community-based and prevention programs? So let's see what our group thinks about this one. Only 10% would take a hardline approach. We're too soft on crime, we need to get tougher. But 62%, almost 2/3 of our group, is willing to spend more on police protection as long as we spend more on preventative measures. Just over a quarter believe we should reduce police spending to fund social services. And if we were to go back and look at our responses from a year ago, June, we saw a much higher level among this group in answer to that question. And 1%, also somewhat lower than last year, that want to replace police departments altogether. So now let's take this conversation from the local election in New York City to the national political landscape. Because President Biden has long understood the importance of crime and public safety policy to Republican candidates and the importance of not letting Republicans argue that Democrats can't be trusted on these issues. Biden's roots are in the Rust Belt working class, for whom law enforcement and safety have always been central to the political and societal conversation. In the 1990s, if you remember, Biden worked with then President Bill Clinton to pass a tough on crime legislative package, for which both men have now been criticized, and from which Biden has now distanced himself to some degree. But in that era, the Clinton-Biden crime bill allowed Democrats to regain the political center. And even in last year's campaign, when Biden was working in the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy to demonstrate his belief in social and racial justice, if you remember, he was very careful to distance himself from the more dramatic calls for change that many among his party's progressive base were calling for. He very specifically rejected the calls to quote unquote defund the police that were more popular at that time. And he very visibly rejected the either or approach for which voices on both ends of the political spectrum were pushing. And that caused Biden some political problems because so many of his younger and more progressive supporters were disappointed that he wasn't more aggressive on this issue. Biden was determined not to let Trump paint him with the same brush as the more dramatic advocates for change. So look, Biden knows that Democrats don't need to be seen as being as tough on crime as Republicans. But Democrats do much better, he knows, when voters believe that they are tough enough to be entrusted with the public safety. So in a week in which Washington was focusing over many of his own administration's top policy goals, Biden knew enough to take the time to take a day out of that busy week to address the rise in violent crime and to outline a package that included measures on gun violence and community programs, but also included increased police funding as well. Now, the president's advisors know that his reelection campaign will depend largely, if not entirely, on the way he handles COVID-19 and the nation's economic recovery. And they recognize that he has ambitious goals on climate change and on immigration and a whole bunch of other policy matters. But Biden understands too that being tough enough on crime will offer him the necessary political protection when he faces the voters again. We saw that emerging political and policy dynamic in New York last week. And it seems to me we're almost certain to see it across the country in campaigns next year and in 2024. So this started in New York City, at least in a political context, but it's going to grow, and this is a debate we should get used to seeing and participating in over the next 2 years and over the next 4 years. Okay, let's go on to our second topic, which is a little bit broader than the types of more specific policy matters we normally cover. Because what I want to talk about for a little bit here today is the larger conversation, not necessarily on a particular matter of public policy or specific issue, but the larger conversation and the larger conflict in the world stage today between democracy on one hand and autocracy and authoritarianism on the other. Now, many of you are familiar with the famous quote from Winston Churchill. He said, quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried," unquote. Now, Churchill's tongue-in-cheek defense of democracy came just 2 years after the end of World War II. And it's worth remembering that at that time, the world wasn't too far past a challenge in which totalitarian forces had fought for their chance to lead the world. But democratic powers in Europe and the United States prevailed and ushered in decades of peace and prosperity. Now, Joe Biden would be the first to tell you that he's not nearly as eloquent as Winston Churchill. But Biden, over the last several months, has been attempting to deliver a similar message on behalf of the importance of democracy, both to voters here in the United States and to an international audience too. Now, for the last several years, China's been arguing to a world audience that their system of government is more efficient, it's more productive, and it's more effective than a much messier form of democracy as we see here in America. So I'm going to dig into this debate in just a minute, but before I do, I'd like to get your thoughts. In fact, I'd like to get your prediction, is that as this worldwide debate is framed on democracy and authoritarianism, what do you think is most likely to happen? Not next week or next month or even next year, but in the long run. What do you think is the most likely outcome of this debate? Will American-style democracy prevail? Will Chinese-style authoritarianism prevail? Do you think that both will succeed to some degree on the world stage and end up sharing primacy? Or do you think that neither of these two approaches to governance will ultimately succeed and we'll see something else emerge in the years ahead? Well, let's see what we get here. 55%, very interesting, 55%, more than half of you believe that neither of these two arguments is going to prevail in a decisive way. And while it's worth noting that by a almost 4-to-1 margin, our group thinks that American-style democracy is more likely to prevail globally than Chinese-style authoritarianism, you add up those two categories and they still come out to roughly half of a shared world order, if you will. But of course, that's not going to stop. And in fact, it might even encourage both sides of the debate to dig in and push even harder. So Biden's been making it clear that he wants to use his time as president to prove that democracy is the right approach. And I'm going to quote to you from his address to Congress earlier this spring. Quote, said Biden, "We have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works and can deliver for the people. Those who believe American democracy won't prevail are wrong, and we have to prove them wrong." And what's most important to me about that statement is a sentence that I'm going to repeat again. We have to prove that our government still works and can deliver for the people. So Biden clearly sees that the best way to prove democracy is the preferred course, both here in the US and internationally, is to get things done and to make government work more effectively than it's worked in many years. And this is a theme that Biden has returned to over and over again over the months. Back in March, in his first press conference as president, Biden said, quote, "It's clear, absolutely clear, that this is a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies." Last month, when he left for Europe for the G7 and NATO meetings, Biden wrote a Washington Post op-ed in which he said the following, quote, "This is the defining question of our time. Can democracies come together to deliver real results for our people in a rapidly changing world? Will the democratic alliances and institutions that shaped so much of the last century prove their capacity against modern day threats and adversaries?" I believe the answer is yes. And just last week, when Biden was describing the agreement that he and the congressional negotiators had come to on infrastructure, and we'll get to that more later, even before talking about the bill's economic benefits, Biden said, quote, "This infrastructure bill signals to the world that we can function, that we can deliver. We can do significant things, show that America's back," unquote. This is an idea that animates everything Biden does, whether it's talking to Congress or the White House press corps here, or the G7 or NATO meetings in Europe. Biden's main theme throughout his presidency to date is that democracy is the most effective form of government. And this message is aimed almost entirely at China. Biden sees his presidency as a key moment in world history. He likes to say that we're in a competition between democracies and autocracies. And as I said earlier, he believes that in order to win that competition, democracies need to demonstrate they can still deliver for the people. So that's why he talks about his domestic agenda, not just as only about Americans, but as winning global competition against autocracies like China and Russia and Iran and Turkey and North Korea and so on. Now, China, as I said earlier, argues the opposite, that their brand of authoritarian capitalism is predictable and it produces prosperity. And they argue very forcefully that the American model is socially divisive and politically unpredictable and economically reckless. And they've had some success with that message, not only with developing countries to whom they've provided economic support and COVID relief. But that message has had some success with our traditional allies in Europe and Asia, and many of those countries seem to be hedging their bets by trying to maintain their relationships with both the US and China. So sometimes this is cast as the new Cold War, in which the rest of the world is forced to choose sides. So Biden tries to keep the discussion at a broader level. He talks about democracy and autocracy more generally than directly attacking China. Now, this also helps him with domestic politics. Former President Trump attacked our election process, and he often sided with foreign authoritarian leaders. So for Biden, talking about democracy allows him to create a political distinction between him and Trump without talking about Trump. And so his hope is that the idea of boosting America's democracy might help calm partisan passions. And we're going to talk about bipartisanship in the context of infrastructure in just a minute. Biden said over and over again that he believes that a strong middle class is a prerequisite for stable democracy. So he ties these ideas together in an economic context as well. But Biden sees bipartisanship as a key to stability and as a key to predictability and as a key to making democracy work better and look to the world as a preferable alternative to autocratic governments. And that's a much, much bigger argument than one over infrastructure or tax reform or even climate change. And Biden will continue to argue throughout the next 3.5 or 7.5 years, as the case may be, as to the importance of winning that broader argument, or as many of you suggested, at least arriving at some kind of shared level of responsibility with China, as opposed to ceding that ground to authoritarianism, the way many in this country and around the world have come to believe in the past. So let me ask you another question, and Claire, this one's a little bit more philosophical. Should Biden be emphasizing, to the degree that he is this something Biden should be talking about, the democracy versus authoritarianism conflict? And there's obviously yes and no answers here, but there's a couple, if you see, there's a couple different yes answers and a couple different no answers. So if you think he should be talking about this, tell us not only that you think so with a yes, but tell us why. Should he be emphasizing this conflict, as option A suggests, because America, here at home, Americans need a wake-up call? Or should he be emphasizing it, but that it's more important to an international audience than to a domestic one? Or alternatively, should he be talking about more tangible things, more of the kitchen table issues that Biden himself says that politicians should spend more time talking about? And you think this is something he shouldn't be emphasizing? Is it because you think it's the last thing we need is a new Cold War and this will provoke a real potential confrontation with China? Or no, that it's just too abstract for American voters? And by talking about jobs, by talking about clean energy, by talking about immigration, by talking about healthcare, he'll be able to reach the American people in a way that this broader discussion can't. So I guess we're asking you two questions here today on this one. Should Biden be talking about this concept so much or not? And depending on whether you say yes or no, tell us why. So Claire, let's see how our group has navigated that question. Wow, look at that. Wow. 91% of you do believe that it's important for Biden to be stressing this point. 91%. The overwhelming majority of you, 2/3, think it's because our country needs a wake-up call. But another 22% see the benefits in this for an international audience too. And then less than 10% say that he shouldn't be talking about it. A relatively small number, 3%, believe that it's too belligerent toward China. And 6% just don't think the American people will get it. Very, very interesting. So we're going to go on to our third and final issue now. And then, of course, Jessica will rejoin me and we'll get to your questions, which is, you've heard me say many times before, is my favorite part of our webinars. So let's talk for a few minutes about the debate going on in Washington, D.C. over a bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, I've alluded to it a couple times here already because it relates to those broader concepts of bipartisanship and democracy that Biden talks about. But let's bring this down to the policy level, a more tangible level for a moment. Now, I'll concede this. For those of you who've been trying to keep up with the negotiations in Washington over infrastructure legislation, I wouldn't blame you at all if all the back and forth is causing a bit of whiplash. I mean, this is incredibly important from a policy standpoint, but it also reflects the most frustrating parts of Washington, D.C., the focus on process versus substance, the back and forth between the two parties, the machinations between the two sides. It does get somewhat frustrating to follow. So I'll spend a few minutes trying to explain it, and then my guess is we'll end up coming back to this issue more than once again over the course of the summer as the negotiations continue. So first, the basics. There are actually two infrastructure bills, one for traditional infrastructure or physical infrastructure, and one for what the White House calls social infrastructure or family infrastructure. The first, the physical infrastructure bill, would fund about $1 trillion or so of roads, of bridges, of broadband expansion, and the types of things we normally think about in this context. The other, the family infrastructure legislation, would concentrate more on social services and could range anywhere from $2 trillion to $6 trillion, depending on how negotiations within the Democratic Party conclude. The family infrastructure bill would encompass additional funding in areas like childcare, climate change, Medicare expansion, higher education access, and possibly immigration policy. And Biden needs 60 votes for that first bill on physical infrastructure because he needs to be able to break a filibuster. So he needs 60 votes, and it appears right now that he may have it, as no fewer than 11 Republicans have worked with a bipartisan group made up of roughly an equal number of Democrats that might have Biden to where he needs to be to get this physical infrastructure bill through. For the second one, the second bill, it now appears will be passed through the reconciliation process that we've discussed in the past. It's a budget-related maneuver that would allow the bill to pass along straight party lines with 51 votes, 50 Democratic senators plus Vice President Harris, and a very small and thin majority in the House of Representatives as well. Now, the White House has been dancing back and forth between reassuring Republicans that a bipartisan infrastructure bill and a bigger partisan reconciliation package don't have to be passed together. And at the same time, they're trying to reassure progressives that both are going to pass. And Biden got himself in some trouble on this last week when on Thursday he suggested that he wouldn't sign the bipartisan bill unless the reconciliation package on straight Democratic votes passed as well. Republicans felt like they were pulling a fast one on him. That was Thursday. By Saturday, Biden had pretty much backtracked and said that he would not necessarily need to get the partisan all-Democratic reconciliation bill on family infrastructure to sign the more traditional infrastructure bill on roads and bridges and broadband and so on. And as soon as he did that, of course, progressive Democrats started getting angry because they're worried that more moderate Democrats, having passed a bipartisan physical infrastructure bill, are not going to want to spend even more money on a strictly partisan family and social infrastructure bill. To complicate things even further, given the sharp disagreement on how all this infrastructure should be paid for, it's not entirely clear that that even this physical infrastructure bill pays for the spending that it calls for. The problem is that both sides had some bottom line issues on which they just wouldn't compromise. Both sides compromised on an awful lot of things on the spending side, but on the revenue side, the lines were a lot heavier drawn. Republicans said, we're not going to repeal the 2017 tax cuts. That's not going to be part of this, otherwise we're against it. The Democrats said, well, we're not going to raise the gasoline tax or impose a fee for electric vehicles. because that violates our core principles. So they had to come up with a range of spending measures that, frankly, I think were pretty iffy. Stricter tax enforcement by the IRS, unused unemployment and other emergency funds, sales from the nation's strategic petroleum reserve, public-private partnerships. I will admit it all sounds pretty nebulous to me. So Biden's got a couple of challenges here. Can he convince Republicans that while a family infrastructure bill is important to him, he's not going to hold up a bipartisan physical infrastructure effort in order to get it? And at the same time, he has to convince progressive Democrats that even though the two are informally linked, he's going to fight just as hard for social and family infrastructure as for the roads and bridges. None of that is easy. Paying for it is even more tricky. But as we've talked about earlier today and in the past, this is a really big, important deal for Biden, not just because of the substantive improvements on both physical and family infrastructure, but in Biden's mind as to what it says about how democracy can work. And although he's been able to sign some smaller bore bipartisan legislation in the past, this would be the really first big ticket one supported by members of both parties. And he needs that, not just because of what's in the bill, but because of what it represents. So like I said, we will come back to talking about infrastructure and these back and forth fights over the summer, because these fights are going to continue for most of the summer. But for at least for now, let's put that aside, and hopefully Jessica can rejoin us, and we'll turn this conversation from a monologue into a conversation with our group. What do you think, Jessica?
Sounds good, Dan, and thank you to our audience. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I just wanted to thank all of our viewers for your continued support of our organization, our mission, and these webinars. We depend on your donations to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these important discussions. If you are able to make a donation, please go to our website, which is lawacth.org, and there is a donate button. You can click on that. It is a tax-deductible contribution, and we, of course, greatly appreciate your support to keep our programs going, especially since we're not fully back in person. So anything you guys can contribute is greatly appreciated. All right, so our first question: do Democrats really think that swing voters will forget that Dems spent most of 2020 with calls to defund the police?
Well, it's a really good question, and the answer is we don't know. It's worth remembering that not all Democrats, not even most Democrats, called for defunding the police. A large number of Democratic leaders and office holders did call for reducing police funding in order to shift more money into social services and preventive measure and other types of preventive measures. But the Republicans tried in 2020 to tar them all with that defund the police brush. It didn't work with Biden, but a lot of leading Democrats believe that it's what kept them from achieving more successes in the House and Senate races and achieving safer majorities in both of those chambers. So it didn't work with Biden because he was so emphatic that he didn't want to defund the police. It may have worked better in Senate and congressional races, because Senate and House candidates don't get the same kind of platform, and many of them might not have been quite as clear and quite as direct as Biden was. So the lesson for Democratic candidates, at least those running in swing districts or competitive states, is if they don't want to defend the police, they need to make that very, very clear. Otherwise, the Republican criticisms may have the same type of impact that they did last year. So to me, we know what the Republicans are going to say and do on this. The question is how effectively Democrats who don't want to defend the police are at making that point. And at the same time, balancing that argument with the party's progressive base, many voters of whom would like to see, if not an absolute defunding, a reduction in funds. So, like I said, we know what the Republicans are going to say. The key is going to be how well the Democrats and how effectively the Democrats are able to respond.
What are the pros and cons of ranked choice voting? And maybe if you can give a quick overview of ranked choice voting as well.
Yeah, I skipped past that pretty quickly in our opening moments, only because the topic was more related to the issues discussed in the campaign than the nature of it. But ranked choice voting, which New York City accomplished earlier this year, is a fascinating experience. Excuse me, a fascinating experiment in representative democracy. Most elections, as we all know, involves marking a ballot for one choice or the other, or in a primary, one of many. What ranked choice voting does, and it's been used in San Francisco and Oakland, it's been used in the state of Maine and another municipality in the state of Alaska, and in other local and state governments around the country. What ranked choice voting does is it asks voters to list more than one candidate, as few as two, as many as five, which is what New York did, and to ask the voters to rank their top 2, 3, 4, 5 choices in order of preference. The idea is to give voters a chance to vote with their heart rather than their head. As there's been research done that shows a lot of voters don't vote for the candidate who they really prefer because they don't think that candidate can win. That candidate's too liberal, that candidate's too conservative, that candidate isn't well funded enough. And so they end up settling not for their preferred candidate, but rather not for their favorite candidate, but rather for their preferred candidate of those who they think are plausible. And if you rank them on their ballot, this process is also known as an instant runoff. Because what happens is once the results come in with all the first place votes, the candidate with the fewest first place votes is eliminated. And that candidate's second place votes are distributed to the remaining candidates in the race. Then the candidate with the second least votes is eliminated, and his or her votes are distributed to those candidates who that candidate's supporters listed as being their second or third choice. And that keeps going until there's only one candidate left. Now, Eric Adams, the front runner, appears to emerge as the Democratic primary victor and therefore as the next mayor of New York. But they're still counting ballots to see if the second and third and fourth and fifth choices of the candidates who didn't achieve much support are going to go to Adams as expected, or if they're going to go to his top two competitors. Now, Maya Willie, the most progressive candidate in the race, and the only top tier candidate who did continue to talk about reducing police funding, is running well behind Adams after the first round of voting. She would have to win an overwhelming majority of the second and third choice ballots in order to win. But New York is by far the largest electorate, bigger than any city in the country that's tried this, a larger electorate than any state in the country that's tried this, to experiment with this ranked choice voting. I suspect that unless something very jarring happens as they complete counting the votes over the next week or two, my guess is we're going to see a lot of other cities and perhaps states shift to this procedure in the future in order to make it easier for voters to cast a ballot with their heart, not just calculating the candidate they think is the best chance of winning. So that's a relatively brief and definitely not encompassing description of the process. But the short version is you rank several people. And that means that if your first choice candidate isn't successful, your vote still counts because your second and third and fourth place selections will be applied to the candidates who appear to be more successful.
This next question says, hi, Dan, I sent you the Morning Consult report with extensive polling that the US, and particularly those with a more right-wing ideology in the US, is an outlier in the Western developed democracies in supporting the principles of authoritarianism. It is a growing phenomenon reflected in the ongoing immutable support for Trump among the Republican Party. How can democratic principles prevail in the face of the significant support for voter suppression and other authoritarian tendencies among a huge segment of the American citizenry?
Well, Biden believes, and I think with some justification, is that while he's not going to win over all Republicans or even most Republicans, the strongest Trump supporters will stay loyal to the former president or his successor, should Trump himself decide not to run in 2024. But Biden does believe that he can move some Republicans over and demonstrate through some bipartisan progress to voters of all ideologies that there is some benefit in working together. This is why the infrastructure bill is so important to him, not just because of the roads and the bridges and the child care and so forth, because it can demonstrate to voters, Democrats and some Republicans, that Washington can function. The most strident populist candidates, Donald Trump on the right, Bernie Sanders on the left, they argue that the system's broken, that it can't work. In Biden's core investment, core political investment, is proving to voters that it can work. So the fact that he has 11 Republican United States senators working on a bipartisan basis for infrastructure reform is not enough in his mind, but it marks important progress. And so while it is a considerable challenge that Biden faces, he believes, and again, I think with some justification, that if he can demonstrate forward-moving progress, whether on COVID or on economic growth or on other issues, that he can peel off enough Republicans that bipartisan progress can build on these early steps. I don't mean to minimize the challenge. The questioner is exactly right, but I do believe that whether or not Biden is successful, he has identified the most plausible path to take to try to push back against the challenges that the questioner referred to.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your fifth poll question that it was sort of a philosophical question. So we have another philosophical question coming in. In Plato's Republic, Socrates describes democracies as being an unjust form of government, below aristocracy and democracy, and will devolve into tyranny. Is this something you discuss with your students? Have you ever seen an example of a politician that resembled the philosopher king? And what kind of society do you think would be ready for a leader that loved wisdom and would lead that way?
Boy, those are some very big and broad questions and probably deserve a whole program, either online or in person at some point for us in the future, Jessica. But what I will say to the questioner is, in my political advocacy and communications class, I talk about the rules as they currently exist and less about how to change the makeup of democracy. That said, we talk about, in that class, about the kind of leaders who can succeed in this environment. And I do believe very strongly that those leaders, those candidates who empower the voters, who convince the voters that they have an investment in those voters' success, and who are honest with the voters, are those who have the best chance of success. There's no guarantees. We see plenty of elections where candidates who don't follow that type of path are able to be elected. But I try to talk about it in both a philosophical and a practical sense. For example, I'll tell my class that a candidate shouldn't take two different positions on an issue to two different audiences. I tell them that because philosophically it's wrong and it's misleading. And practically I tell them not to do it because they're probably going to get caught. Again, there are exceptions to every rule, but in that advocacy class, I do try to point out that candidates who appeal to the best of voters rather than the worst do achieve a certain advantage, if not guaranteed success. It's in the leadership classes I teach where we talk about leadership not just in the context of politics, but also in terms of leadership in the areas of business and politics and nonprofits and the military and sports and in communications in many areas. At that point, we get into more philosophical conversations about what qualities make an effective leader. And what I try to get across to the students is the most effective leaders, regardless of those venues I mentioned, draw from the same basic attributes. And what we try to do is help the students do enough of a self-inventory of themselves to see how they can develop those leadership skills as well. So we talk more about the practicalities of these questions in political communications and advocacy. But in the leadership class, we do talk more philosophically. And again, fascinating questions, and certainly questions that deserve a broader and deeper answer than I can give today. So maybe it is a program for us to put together at some point later this year.
Sounds great, thank you. Do schools and academic thinkers study or discuss how traditional democratic principles work in a large, complex, non-homogeneous society with differing values and a low level of understanding or knowledge about many issues facing this country?
Some schools do. Some schools do talk about those things. Some schools don't. Some classes focus on them, some don't. My own belief, very strong belief, not only in terms of higher education, but in terms of elementary and secondary education as well, is we don't do nearly enough of it. And while I happen to teach at the university level, as I think most of you know by now, I think some of you may have heard me talk in the past about my very strong belief that we don't make nearly enough of an effort to teach civics in elementary and secondary schools. Most California high schools require one single semester of civics education. That's 15 weeks of civics and American government and geography, all crammed into a 15-week crash course that's almost always offered in 11th or 12th grade. And the end result of that is we are telling our next generation of leaders, whether political or business or labor or community leaders, we're telling our next generation of leaders that this civic stuff, this government stuff, this politics stuff, this democracy stuff is so unimportant. We're not going to bother talking to you about it for your first 10 years of school. Then after a crash course, we hope that you will become responsible citizens and reliable voters in 18 months when that franchise is given to you. And offering civics at a greater level and at a deeper level and starting it much earlier in a public education process, I think is absolutely critical, not just for the sake of our democracy, but for the sake of these young people, because it's going to much more effectively prepare them for the leadership challenges that they're going to face in their lives once they finish their education. Also probably a topic for a full program discussion, wouldn't you say, Jessica?
We're building up our fall program lineup pretty robustly.
But on that one, I think putting together a panel discussion of experts to talk about how to teach these skills and these attributes and these concepts, not just at the university level, but in high school and even in elementary school, I think is of critical importance. So thank you very much to the questioner for raising it.
Do you think China is as obsessed with the US democratic system as much as the US is obsessed with China's autocracy?
Say yes, at least, probably more. And it has appeared to me over the last several years that China, under its current leadership, sees itself rightfully not just as a world leader, but as the world leader. And the efforts that they make to denigrate the American system and process and outcomes to the rest of the world leads me to the conclusion that China believes, I think correctly, that they will not become the world leader as opposed to a leader unless they are able to successfully diminish the United States and our system of governance in the eyes of the rest of the world. Over the last few years, we've seen American consciousness as it relates to Chinese authoritarianism increase dramatically, but I still don't think it's at the same level of intensity as works in the other direction.
Thank you so much. Sorry, just a lot of questions coming in. Do you think that the trend towards public safety will affect California elections, specifically the race for Attorney General?
I think it will. Because California is a deep blue state, the challenge here is going to be considerably greater than in most swing states around the country. But of course, New York City is a deep blue city in a deep blue state itself. And while Eric Adams is a registered Democrat, he is one who emphasized his public safety credentials. In the campaign for Attorney General next year, Republicans have a couple of candidates on the ballot, most prominently the former district attorney of Sacramento. And while in a deep blue state, you would have to consider Democrats to be strong favorites for every statewide office. I think the best chance that Republicans have of potentially pulling off an upset victory next year would be in that Attorney General's race. We're seeing this at the local level too, where recall efforts have been mounted against the district attorneys of both San Francisco and Los Angeles. And while the state legislature, has not yet reacted to this shift in sentiment, I would be willing to bet that particularly as next year's election comes closer, you will see maybe not that tough on crime message that we heard throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But I do think California will shift in at least some degree in the other direction. Certainly enough to elect more centrist Democrats to legislative and possibly statewide office. Whether it's enough to elect Republicans is something we'll have a much better idea of a year from now.
This is a long question, but it covers a lot of topics on the infrastructure situation and what's going on in DC. They say, Dan, masterful analysis of Biden's worldview and themes about democracy and effectiveness of government at home. How certain is it that there will be 60 Republican votes to pass the bipartisan infrastructure package? And how much does passage of that depend on Democrats not being able to pass the other package by reconciliation? Will Republicans hold the infrastructure package hostage to the soft package? And does Biden have Sinema and Manchin on board for the reconciliation vote? Or are Republicans in the Senate resigned to the reconciliation package and be willing to support the hard package anyway?
I'm guessing, of course, but I suspect that the Republicans will be able to put up enough votes in order to pass the physical infrastructure bill on a bipartisan basis. And the reason I think that's going to happen is because I believe that the Republicans believe that there's no way Biden will get the votes he needs to pass a partisan reconciliation family infrastructure bill. We've talked about this before as it relates to the filibuster and to voting rights and to other issues, but it's important to remember that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, the centrist senators from West Virginia and Arizona, are not the type of ideological outliers in the Democratic Senate caucus that normally appears to be the case. Rather, they tend to be almost the blocking backs to protect other more centrist Democrats who don't want to face the types of criticism that Manchin in particular attracts. So while these two, Manchin and Sinema, are the two most vocal Democratic centrists, there are plenty of others. Mark Kelly from Arizona, Warner from Virginia, Hassan and Shaheen from New Hampshire, Tester from Montana. There are several other more centrist Democratic senators who are perfectly content to let Manchin and or Sinema take the heat for them. And so back to the questioner's thesis and to my response to it, I believe that Republicans will feel secure that they can pass a bipartisan bill that they've had a hand in shaping and that will allow some of their endangered incumbents to use when they're running for re-election next year, that they'll be able to pass that physical infrastructure bill, some Republican votes, and that still won't be good enough to get 50 Democratic senators all on the same page. Remember, Bernie Sanders says he believes that the family infrastructure bill should be roughly $6 trillion. And now Elizabeth Warren and others in the caucus have said the same thing. Manchin said over the weekend that he sees a $1 to $2 trillion family infrastructure bill. Can Biden help them find a common ground? Perhaps. But it's not enough of a sure thing, in my opinion, to keep Republicans from passing the physical infrastructure, roads and bridges and broadband bill, because I think they believe that they can keep 50 senators, 50 Democratic senators from signing on to a family bill. And they also believe that with a 4-seat majority in the House, that Pelosi might have some trouble keeping more than a handful of Democratic House members from straying. So there's no way to know for sure, and this is going to go on for a while. But the most likely outcome is that Republicans do put up the votes for physical infrastructure, and the Democrats are not able to get 51 votes for family infrastructure.
We received this question a couple of times. What is your opinion of Governor Ron DeSantis wanting college students and professors to disclose their political views? A story within the last week that has received very little press.
I think it's silly, but not for the reasons that most of DeSantis's opposition would. Governor DeSantis, as the questioner indicated, has begun to advocate that students, college students and professors should let their ideological leanings be known in order to promote and achieve ideological diversity at colleges and universities throughout his state. So I come at this a little bit differently. In my classes, in all of my classes, I tell the students on day one that I want them to be analysts and not advocates in my classes. Outside of class, I want them to advocate very strongly for the issues and causes and candidates that are important to them, from the left or the right. But in class, we're here to analyze and to learn how smart people of both parties and all ideologies get things done. And so I tell them, I said, if you want to read about my own partisan history, you can see that go online and see that I worked in Republican politics for many years before switching to become an independent 10, 11 years back. And if you want to talk about that, you want to talk about my own feelings on these matters, then come to my office hours. Tell them, take me to coffee. I can be bribed. But in class, we set that aside. And to me, I think that's a much smarter approach either than what DeSantis is calling for or the current system in too many schools, where way too many professors use their classroom as a bully pulpit from which to inflict, and I use the word inflict very specifically, their own ideology on their students. DeSantis's reaction, or perhaps overreaction, are to professors who abuse the privilege we give them. The answer is not to sharpen the partisan divide even further, but to move it outside the classroom. Use the classroom itself as a place to learn, so then the students can go outside of class and stand up for the things that are important to them.
And I'll nominate you for Secretary of the Department of Education so we can get this going. How should the Democrats respond to Republicans' attempts to paint the Democratic Party as socialists and communists? What does the Republican Party stand for today?
So, two questions. The best way for Democrats to push back against accusations of socialism is to explain why they're not socialists. And once again, this is something Biden did very effectively during his campaign last year, but something that lower profile Senate and House candidates tended to struggle with to a much greater degree. Politics, Democrat and Republican, for as long as it's existed, has involved people making harsh charges, some accurate and some not, about their opponents. When you're the target of those harsh attacks, you defend yourself. And if your defense is credible, then the voters believe you, and if they don't, and if it's not, then they don't. So I think the question for Democrats is how to point out, either depending on their own political upbringing and the constituencies they represent, either why they're not socialists, or in some cases, why socialism is not something that should be considered a pejorative, as it is in the insults that are thrown. Joe Biden and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez handle that charge much, much differently than each other. Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin handle the charge much differently from each other. But depending on the circumstances, particularly in those swing districts, the Biden-Manchin pushback needs to be forceful. And in a Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez situation, it needs to be accompanied by an explanation. What Republicans stand for is a question we should probably set aside a full topic for, maybe not a full hour, but a full topic for in a future webinar. But one of the most wrenching debates going on within the Republican Party right now is to the extent to which party regulars' beliefs are about public policy or about a single individual. And most of the anti-Trump, or as I like to call them, pre-Trump voices in the party, point out, I think usually correctly, that successful political parties on all sides tend to be most successful when they're based on policy-driven ideology, and they tend to be less successful when they focus on a particular individual. Well, Trump disproved that theory in 2016. He saw the downside of it in 2020. But to me, the most protracted and perhaps the most important fight that's going to go on within the Republican Party, not just until next year, but until summer of 2024, is whether the party should stand for a set of policy priorities or an individual, whether it be Donald Trump or someone else.
Wonderful. Well, that hour again flew by. So Dan, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. To our audience, thank you for all of your great questions. And again, we'd love to have you become a member or support us. So visit our website to also learn about our upcoming events at lawacth.org. We will be back here next Tuesday after the 4th of July holiday with Dan. So please make sure to sign up for that. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, Dan. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks to all the rest of you. And we'll look forward to seeing you in 7 days. Have a very happy and enjoyable and safe holiday weekend. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.